In order to move to the next level in JavaScript, we need to dive into objects. What objects are, how we create them, and how we use them in JavaScript. It is really important that we understand that everything inside of JavaScript is an object, including functions. And those objects are relatable to our real world, and they help us as developers understand what we're developing and how we're developing it, because we can apply it to the real world. Now, that may have sounded totally confusing. So let's jump into what I'm trying to say by drawing it out. And let's start out with the fact that everything in our daily lives we view as objects. They are things inside of our world. And when we look at those things have abilities and they have data about them that describe them. So let's dive into that really quick. In our world, we have a lot of objects, right? And those objects can be very different and have different abilities and data that describes them. So let's take two examples right here. And let's talk about this one right here. And let's talk about something that we're really used to. People. So a person. A person is an object in our world. So we'll put that right there. And then we have other objects that we interact with all the time. So in this case, since we're all using one, let's do a computer. A computer is another object that lives in our world. Now we think of these as objects or a classification or group of things that are very similar, that have very similar data that represents them or describes them, and similar functionality. In other words, things that they can do. And so in our world, we are going to be concentrating on abilities or the functions that they have. So we'll talk about abilities, which correspond to functions or methods that this thing has. Let's just go ahead and put this right here so that we can identify that in each group. And then we're going to talk about the data or attributes. So let's do attributes. And that corresponds to the data that describes them or makes them what they are, makes them unique. Okay? So with that, let's go ahead and talk about a person first, and then we'll talk about a computer. Now, a person has very specific attributes or data that describes them as an individual. And all humans or all people have these attributes, but the values that are stored in those attributes may be different based on the person that we're encountering. So let's go ahead and let's do some examples of that. So here, inside of our person, if we're talking about a person may have, or they will have, sorry, a hair color. And we do that all the time in like driver's licenses and anything that describes us. A hair color, eye color, and they may have, or they will have a, so hair color, eye color, and then what's something else we can describe them with? We can use height. Let's do height. They'll have a height, and then they also have a weight, so we could add weight to that category of attributes that a person will have that will be different or may be different from someone else. So these are the attributes of a person. Now a computer, it has different types of attributes. It can have a number of processors, right? And so that's an attribute that a computer might have. It could have the amount of RAM is going to be different. Some have 4 gigs, some have 8 gigs, some have 32 gig. And then you may have hard drive space. And these are going to be attributes that set these computers apart and make them unique as individual computers. So right now we're describing categories, a person, a computer. But we're going to have a whole lot of individuals in that category that have their own specific data that fills in these attributes. In other words, the values that will be in these attributes are going to be different based on the computer. Now these are attributes, so let's make sure we identify that. These ones right here are all attributes. We need to remember that this is the data that describes the individual that fits inside of this category of object. Now we may also have inside of our computer or inside of our person abilities or functions / methods that this thing can do. So a person can walk. So we'll go ahead and do walk. And on average, a person can walk if they have that ability. And most humans or most people start out with that ability unless they have a defect. So walk, we can run, we can talk, right? And those are our abilities or things that we can do. And then a computer has ability too. It can read. So it can read from its RAM. It can read from its hard drive space. It can write. It can write to the RAM. It can write to the hard drive space. And it can turn on / off. And those are abilities that it can do or things that it can do. And usually these things or these abilities will change or can change the state of the object or modify these attributes. And so let's go ahead and identify those really quick as abilities. These are things that it can do. And as I've already hinted, the attributes are going to be data. In other words, we're going to have values in there, whereas abilities are going to be functions. They are going to be actual things that the computer can do or that the person can do. So again, they're functions. And so when we jump into JavaScript syntax on how we create objects and how we build unique objects with their own unique attributes and their own abilities, we'll get to see how we might implement objects in JavaScript using this premise right here. So let's go ahead and jump into that really quick, and let's do it in JavaScript and create ourselves a person with its own abilities and its own attributes. So how we do this in JavaScript is, so let person1 equal, and the syntax for creating an object literal is we use a curly brace just like we do in functions when we're creating a function body. But here, instead of using statements to execute code, we are going to be assigning the attributes and the abilities of this object using a special syntax inside of these curly braces. And that syntax is going to be like this. Let's see, inside of our diagram, if we go back to that diagram, we had eye color, hair color, height, weight, and then walk, run, and talk. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's do eye color. This is going to be an attribute. And well, right here, we kind of used a generic thing of person instead of person1. But because we're creating an object and we're doing it literally on the fly right here, this object is going to have very specific data that is specific to a specific person. So let's go ahead and change this to me, Tim. So this is going to be person Tim is what we're going to do. Person Tim. And my eye color is actually blue. So we're going to go ahead and use blue for my eye color. Now this is the syntax for creating an object. We use a key, and the key is the unique identifier or a variable name, and then this is the value. and we separate that by a colon. And the colon is the within an object. This is the kind of like the assignment operator. It says, hey, let's create a variable that lives inside of this object, and then let's assign the value to it of blue. And then to get to the next property, we just use a comma, and then we give another key. So we did eye color, let's do hair color, and it's going to be brown. And then we also had eye color, hair color, height, and weight. So we'll go back and do height and weight. So we've got to have a key for height, and we'll say 6 foot, I wish. And then we'll do weight, and we'll say 190. All right. So this gives us the eye color, the hair color, the height and weight. And because these hold values, in this case strings, actually, why are we making these strings? Let's just make them numbers. Why strings? All right, so blue is definitely a string, brown is a string, height is 6, and weight is 190. Okay, so these would be properties or attributes that make this person that is specific to Tim, or person Tim, very unique. The next thing we can do is we can create the abilities or the methods that this particular object can do. Let's go ahead and let's give this also a name. And that way we know this object is who it says it is in the variable name. So the name is Tim. And then let's give ourselves some functions. And in our description, we had the ability to walk, run, and talk. So let's go ahead and create those abilities or methods. Now, just like we learned when we learned about functions, we can add a function as an anonymous function to a variable, and we called that a function expression or an expression function. And we do the exact same thing here when we're creating a function within a person, which makes it what we call a method or an ability of that object. So here, let's go ahead and do talk, and we're going to give it an anonymous function, and that function is going to go ahead and do something. So normally we don't want to use a console.log inside of objects and stuff like that, because that's just not good practice. We're going to return something. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and return the string that we want as a result of talking. And so let's do this. Let's say this.name plus, and then let's give it a string to add to that. And it'll be, if we're calling this.name, we're asking for the property name of this object, the object that we're in. So this refers to the object that this function or this method is running in. So if we want to think about this, really what this does is it allows us to get to the data that makes this person object unique. And we have to use this to get to it. And that is because this allows us to get into the brain of the object where all of this data is stored and access these values. So we say this.name, so it's going to be Tim says hello to you. All right, and let's go ahead and let's have it do that really quick. Let's have it perform that ability or that action. So we're going to do console, and here's where we're going to do a console.log just to check the output. Console.log, we're going to say persontim.talk. We're going to execute that function, and it doesn't take any data in because the data that it uses is self-contained in the object. It's part of the attributes that make this object unique. So we're accessing its own objects by using this, because this always refers to the object that this function is being executed in. In other words, this method is being executed, and this method belongs to this object that is referenced by the person Tim variable. So this, again, always refers to the object, and it allows us to get to the data or the attributes that make this object unique. And in this case, we are accessing the name attribute of this object, and we are putting it into a string and returning that string. And in this case, we invoke that method on the object, and because this method is being invoked as a method of the object, it's going to go ahead and execute this. This is going to refer back to this object. It's going to go to the attribute that we specified, which is name. It's going to pull that value out, and that value is then going to be inserted into the string. And we probably don't want that to be capital because that would be bad grammar. So let's go ahead and execute this and see what we get. Tim says hello to you. So let's demonstrate the fact that this refers to the object that this method belongs to. And let's do that by removing this, and then let's execute. You'll see that the error we get is name is not defined. And that is because inside of our function, we don't define a variable name and then we give it some kind of a value. This is wrong. And then execute it. Because this is wrong would be a variable that is local to the scope of this function, and it's not using the data that makes this object unique. So we wouldn't want to create a local variable. We want to use the data within our object that this ability belongs to. And so to do that, we have to make sure we're using this, because this is just an automatic keyword that is given to us, and it is by JavaScript automatically tied or bound to the object. In other words, it is a variable that is automatically created for us that has a reference to our object. And with that, we can access the internal attributes that make this object unique, and we can use the values held in those attributes inside of our functions to do whatever we need to do. So hopefully that makes it crystal clear. I've kind of really beat that to death, and we want to make sure that we understand that, but I'm not going to go any further on that. So let's go ahead and let's add another ability. We've got talk. Let's do walk, because we said that was an ability that it has. And we'll do a function, and we will return this dot name plus, so it'll be Tim is walking away. And because we're returning a string that is added the value of the name property, we can just go ahead and copy this and change this to walk and execute it using the parens. And now when we execute that JavaScript, we've got Tim is walking away. So when we have an object, we can use its data inside of its abilities to do stuff, and we can ask that object to do something by invoking a method or a function that belongs to that object. We can also get to the properties directly. We don't have to use a function. Because we have these properties available right here, we can actually call them directly. So I can say console.log, and I can say persontim.name, and right here we'll see that I can access that property and get that value. I can do console.log, and I can do persontim.iColor, and you can see the properties right there in the autocomplete. I can execute it and I get blue. So I can access them. I can also update them, which means I can change these values in my program by simply assigning a new value to any of these properties. So let's say that I exercised a ton, and I decided that that was fun. I did it a lot, and I ended up losing some weight. So I can change my weight by just saying persontim.weight equals, using the assignment operator, to 180. Maybe I lost 10 pounds. And now if I do a console.log and I pass in persontim.weight, and then we go ahead and execute that, I should see that my weight is now 180. And if we move, or we copy this and we move it before the assignment expression or statement, we should see a 190, and then it drops to 180. So let's go ahead and run that again. 190, 180. So here we have seen, number one, that our objects can have attributes that make them unique because the values in here are unique. And then we can have objects that have functions or abilities that let them do something. Right now in our examples, they're not really doing much other than building a string and returning that string to whoever called it. Right here we're making the call to execute that method, and then we are just logging it to the console. But we can have our person do things that end up with a result other than just a string. And we can see some examples of that as we progress through these JavaScript lessons. We'll get into more complex examples of objects and the abilities that they provide. In fact, in our next video, we're going to talk about some objects that are provided to us by the JavaScript API, and we'll get to see the functions and data that are on those built-in objects that we can use to actually accomplish specific tasks inside of a JavaScript application or script. So we've gone through what makes an object an object. We've talked about the methods or functions that allow an object to do something. We've identified how this is a variable, a keyword variable that is provided to us that is automatically bound to our object so that we can access and use the information that it holds in its brain. And then we've seen how to execute methods on an object, as well as how to access properties on an object to see what the values are inside of the object's properties. And then we have also seen how to update or change / reassign the value that a property holds just by simply assigning it a new value. Hopefully this helps you understand JavaScript objects and the JavaScript literal object definition right here. It's called an object literal because we are literally creating the object in one go using this block syntax and then using this key value pair syntax. And what I mean by key value pair is you have a key and then you have a value and they make a pair. And then of course it's separated by a comma with another key value. And it's the same with the methods as well. You've got a key and then the value ends up being a full-blown anonymous function definition.